May we start?
I want to get your opinion on something.
To the bigger picture. Now it's time.
From B Media Production, this is Podcasting Essentials.
Hi, and welcome to Episode 2, Season 3. I'm Nick Schulberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. This episode, we hear from Kelli Hurley of Westwood One, America's largest audio broadcast company, and how they're embracing podcasts to complement their traditional radio model. But first, I'd like to welcome my co-host, Chris Ashmore.
G'day, Nick. Yeah, look, there's been a bit of heartache recently amongst the podcasting world about season and episode numbers in the title of podcasts, and quite frankly, Apple just doesn't like it.
No, it comes on the back of Apple asking producers to remove spammy metadata from their titles, which includes season and episode numbers, which is a good thing. You don't want junk in the title. But where it got a little bit scary was Apple said, and if you don't do it, we'll remove your podcast from the directory. And people with lots of episode numbers in their titles went, oh no, that this is going to be a disaster.
Well, it'll be 2/3 or 3/4 of all podcasts probably have the episode and season numbers in their titles.
Apple have backed down from that and have softened it a bit, saying, yeah, we can deal with the episode and season numbers. But I guess it does raise that question of what should podcasters that are starting right now think about when they're writing their titles.
Well, yeah, as you say, it's understandable from Apple's point of view, or any app, that every title, every podcast has its own system, its own methodology, and it looks a bit, I suppose, rubbish within their apps. But at the end of the day, even with Apple, it's difficult to find particular episode numbers and season numbers. Even they aren't doing it so well. When you put the fields in, it doesn't come up. It's not obvious. So what we do, and we include our episode and season titles. So if you see, Podcasting Essentials, this is S3E2 to represent Season 3, Episode 2. And the reason we do it, it just makes it easy to see from a list where you're at and whether you've listened to the previous episode or not. But also, not all are listened to on Apple Podcast app, and they don't necessarily have these fields in it. So I think for the time being, we're going to continue doing it, but that might change. It might have to change. I don't know.
Well, Spotify, which is now looks to be the fastest growing place where people are consuming podcasts, and in some markets has overtaken Apple.
That's right.
They don't list the season number and episode number. So I agree with you. For those that it's important to sort of list your episodes in an order to make it easy for the consumers to see what's next and what came before it, then, yeah, I'm with you. Leave those numbers in there if you want to, and don't fear that Apple's going to boot you off.
That's right. And just quickly, in speaking of titles, just remember that, look, keep it short. I don't think you need to go more than 7 words in an episode title. Think of it as a heading of a book. 3 to 7 words should be enough to explain what your episode's about. And even if you put the season and episode in the title, just keep it short or abbreviated like we do, S3E2 to represent this podcast as Season 3, Episode 2. That's all you need. There's not much real estate in the title.
Yeah, I like some podcasts that do a season of, say, 6 episodes, and where it's important that you listen to them in order. Now, this podcast, not so much, because you can jump around, but if you're telling a story and you need to go through from 1 to 6, some of those podcasts in the title would do 1 dot and then the title name, 2 dot and the title name. I think that's a really neat and easy way to make sure that everyone's going to see the correct order. Moving on to the next topic, IAB Australia released their audio advertising State of the Nation at the end of Feb, and stats don't work great in podcasting format, but there are just a couple of things I think we should highlight. The first of which, 13.8 million Australians are streaming audio content each month. And it comes as no surprise that with that sort of number of people consuming audio that way, that 91% of advertisers are either advertising in podcasts or plan to in the year ahead. And you might think, wow, 91%, big number, which it is. Just 2 years ago, it was only 67% of advertisers that were using podcasts to advertise.
Wow, it's a big jump.
It is. And similarly, ad agencies are also significantly increasing their use of podcasts ads. 6 out of 10 advertised in podcasts in 2018, and another quarter plan to use podcasts in 2019. So the agencies are definitely coming at it quicker.
That's great. That's great for our industry in Australia, finally.
Yeah, I think in the last episode, Sharon said that the estimate is $700 million-ish in advertising this year, and she thinks that we'll blow through that. And I think with these numbers, I think backing that up as well, that it's going to be a huge year for advertising in all forms of streaming audio. Now, moving on to today's interview, Chris, where advertising also plays a major role, you caught up with Kelli Hurley.
Well, that's right. Look, radio stations are starting to make inroads into podcasting, and it kind of makes sense that they are with the infrastructure they have in place and the know-how and the talent to make content for on-demand audio. So for me, it was an absolute pleasure to chat with Kelli Hurley, the SVP of Digital Partnerships at Westwood One in the United States. As you mentioned earlier, the largest audio broadcasting company in America. They've invested a lot of resources into podcasting in recent years, and, you know, for them, it's only going to get bigger and better. So my first question to Kelli was if she could just explain what Westwood One is about.
Westwood One is the largest audio network in the United States. We reach 245 million listeners on a weekly basis through our broadcast radio footprint, which is a combination of owned and operated stations through our owner, Cumulus Media, and then affiliated stations that we syndicate content to, which equates to over 8,000 stations across the country. So we have a vast footprint in terms of radio station coverage. And in the last 3 years, we built up and developed and launched our Westwood One podcast network focused on original content in the podcast space.
So that's been a no-brainer really for you guys to get into podcasting. When did you start doing that?
Well, it really started with myself in early 2016. I, had a vision and went a little bit rogue outside of what I was hired to do, and went out and recruited an independent podcaster who had amassed a following of about 25,000 downloads per episode, and convinced him to come and partner with us, and we would monetize his podcast with advertising and promote it on the radio to help grow his audience. And he agreed to work with us. And in June of 2016, we sold the first ever podcast ad in his podcast for $400. And I got into quite a bit of trouble with my boss at the time, but I kept forging on and sharing my vision and, hope for, the growth of this vertical. And as we sit today, we have a lot more revenue on the books than $400. So it's been a really great success story.
Did it take a bit of effort in the beginning to convince advertisers to jump on board with advertising on podcasts?
A little bit. There were certainly some early adopters in the space. There's been some agencies that really saw, I think, the early opportunity in podcasting. So for them, it wasn't necessarily convincing them to come on board with podcasting. It was more about convincing them that we were becoming a serious player and to partner with us on some of the shows that we were bringing into our portfolio. But certainly, there's a lot of examples of other advertisers who have been really slow to the space. And now I think they're really starting to see that they've been too slow and are regretting some of their past decisions because a lot of their competitors have gotten into the space and blocked them out of a lot of programming that they would otherwise, probably want to be a part of.
Wow, is that right? Well, what kind of podcasts do you produce?
We are really dominant in political talk. We represent one of the largest political shows in the country, and in turn, one of the largest podcasts in the country, The Ben Shapiro Show, which falls under our partnership with The Daily Wire. That's been a huge success story for us. Outside of political talk, we have a lot of really strong sports podcasts. On the broadcast side of our business, we are partnered with CBS Sports Radio and NBC Sports Radio. So both of those relationships transfer to the podcast space for us. And then entertainment. We've got some big names in entertainment like Ross Matthews, and continuing to build up that portion in terms of our genre and content.
Well, radio is still important and a lot of people still listen to the radio, but what's different about podcasting and why is podcasting becoming so popular with audiences?
I think honestly because it is such an uncluttered ad environment and it's a different way of consuming. So when you're listening to the radio, it's something that, you typically get into your car, you turn on the dial and, you kind of lean back and listen to whatever is being served to you. With podcasting, you're really seeking out the content more, and it's a much more leaned in experience where, you have to kind of know what you're searching for. You have to go through several steps before you can really listen to a podcast. So it takes a little bit more effort. And once you're there, a lot of people tend to listen on their smartphones. So you're listening through headphones. And I think it's just, you feel like that host is speaking more to you and the content is really aligned with your interests because of all of the things I just mentioned that you have to go through to listen. And so I think that you are finding a really engaged, passionate listener that's paired up really well with really great content and great storytelling. And so they tend to respond more to the advertisements because the host is delivering them really natively and organically within the fabric of their show, and thus exciting the listener to kind of be part of the revolution and part of the experience along with that host.
That's exactly what happens with Ben Shapiro's show. He reads all these ads as a host read thing. Is that what is better for advertising? Of course, I don't want you to annoy other advertisers that you might have that do non-read ads, but what is it about host read ads that is better perhaps than other ads?
I think it really boils down to what the advertiser is trying to achieve, but also really keeping in mind the listener experience. So because Ben and many of our other hosts only do the voice to read in content, you have to think there's no disruption for the listener. The listener is, listening to this great content, they're listening to their favorite host, and they don't get a break where it's cutting to a commercial. They may not even realize at first that they're being fed a commercial by the host because it's so seamlessly integrated into what that host is already talking about. And Ben, really does an incredible job, and I think is one of the best in the business in terms of relating the ad to what he is speaking about in that moment. So it's a really compelling listener experience, and one that the listeners actually, through all of our data and research, claim that they enjoy ads in podcasts when it is read by the host. They actually enjoy listening to them.
Well, you offer a range of sports podcasts in your portfolio. Probably it's only just starting to happen here in Australia, but what is it about sport in particular and people talking about sport which makes it good as a podcast?
Well, I think, again, you want to talk about a passionate listener. Sports fans tend to be some of the most passionate followers, of their favorite teams or favorite players out there. And, so they're really seeking out content that aligns with their interests. And sports is really, at the top of that pile. And I think podcasting traditionally really started as a male-dominated platform in terms of demographics. Females are starting to listen a lot more, but I think you find that sports content does so well because of that male skew in the space, and that's certainly a content genre that men tend to seek out more so than women. Not saying women don't listen to sports content at all, but that tends to be the traditional sense of things. And you just have such a rabid, loyal fan base that really wants not only to hear, the top headlines, but dig more into the story of sports and the statistics of sports that they maybe necessarily don't get in other areas of media consumption.
If we can turn our attention to branded podcasts, Kelli, and it's something which is starting to gain traction here. What are your thoughts about branded podcasts? Do they work?
I think you have to have the right partner. You have to have the right model. You have to really take your time and go into it very strategically. I have seen some success stories with branded podcasts, absolutely. So I think they can work. I think they do work, but you have to be very, very smart. You cannot just take your content, find a great host, slap out product, and think it's going to resonate with listeners. Again, you have to give consumers and listeners an experience, content that they need. Why should they listen to this podcast? What are they going to gain from listening to this podcast? And why should they come back to listen again? So you really have to keep those three things in mind when creating a branded podcast, because I think a lot of brands really do have really great information to share with consumers that tells a deeper story, that's more informational, educational, but they really have to find the right way to do that so it doesn't turn into an infomercial.
Do you have any example of a branded podcast that's been doing those things well?
I think GE has a podcast here in the States that has done a really nice job of telling a more compelling story. It's got a beautiful narrative. It's got great production value, and it tells more of a story versus, feeling like you're being sold something within that content experience.
Well, we've seen a lot of changes or a lot of development in podcasting in the last, say, 6, 12 or 18 months. More people listening, more advertisers getting involved. Maybe some final thoughts from you, Kelli. What do you think of the future of audio consumption and production in general and podcasting in particular?
I honestly think it's the most exciting time to be a part of audio. I think that we're seeing such a resurgence, through podcasting. And in turn, I think that's really fueling more of an appreciation of radio and audio in general. If you think about it, consumers are more and more on the go. We are doing, so many activities throughout the day where it gets more and more challenging to consume video, where you have to see something. And audio can follow us wherever we go in almost any activity throughout the day. So it's such a unique space to reach consumers throughout so many different aspects as they move through their day and tell a story and have more of an intimate approach to their lives. And, smart speakers are becoming, so important in terms of discovery, obviously smartphones, in-car connectivity. So I think we're only going to see audio continue to surge and continue to find more and more unique, compelling ways to tell a brand's story and reach consumers.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you very much, Kelli Hurley.
Absolutely. You are so welcome.
That's Kelli Hurley of Westwood One.
That's quite phenomenal growth in only a few years for Westwood One.
It is, seeing that they weren't, just a few years ago, not in it. And today it's huge. And they've recognised that. Kelli's recognised that.
And Kelli's done a great job of creating shows in partnership with some huge broadcasters, especially in the sports area. And I think there's a lesson there for Australian brands looking to get into podcasting, that if you haven't got the budget yourself to do a high-quality podcast, finding other businesses that have a similar audience that you might be able to partner with or get some sponsorship from to then have the funds to create a really good show that will get the cut through and get a better chance of having a higher listenership. And by partnering, you can then also leverage other databases and other audiences with your partners, I think is a really good opportunity for Australian brands.
Well, the advantage Westwood One has is the huge numbers of traditional listeners in radio, and they've capitalised on that by talking about stuff and having shows that the general population is interested in. So we're talking about sports, we're talking about politics, which is all throughout all the different chat shows and on TV. I mean, they're targeting, it's not so much niche, but very broad kind of stuff. Of course, they've got the niche shows as well. But because of that huge market they've got already, they're using, it just makes sense to offer more stuff on demand when people are ready to listen, when they're ready to listen.
And the advertisers are coming on board for those shows as well.
That's right. Well, speaking of advertising, she mentioned that it took a while to get them on board in the beginning. And I always think that the United States is probably a couple of years ahead than what's happening here in Australia. And I think there's a lot of advertising, a lot of advertisers and companies that are interested over there now in advertising and podcasting. And I think it's only just starting here. We mentioned it earlier in the program, but maybe this is the year when big business really stands up and pays attention and looks at shows that they can advertise with or form partnerships with companies. And, to advertise on somebody else's podcast allows you to, I suppose, get your foot in the door with podcasting and see what it's about. Because not every company has the ability to produce podcasts themselves. They don't have the resources. So advertising is a sensible way to get involved. But when it comes to branded podcasts, that's something different again, where you can own that space. But I think the point is, if you do a branded podcast, and this is what Kelli mentioned, is you need a strategy. You need to understand the model. You need to understand, of course, your audience. And knowing how to do it properly, that's a real skill that you've really got to understand or work with a partner to be able to do the branded podcast.
Yeah, well, I think we've had a couple of inquiries just this week from businesses that want to dip their toe in the water with podcasting, and they want to produce just 3 or 4 episodes on a shoestring budget. And my response to them is, with so many podcasts out there, and these are decent-sized businesses as well, are you going to be able to produce something that your audience would expect quality-wise from a brand like yours?
That's the thing. If you're projecting gold-plated service or products that are at the higher end, producing a podcast that doesn't have the qualities as you would expect of, say, commercial radio or the ABC, it's the equivalent of printing out a brochure that is, the images are blurry, there are spelling mistakes, and it's printed upside down on butcher paper.
Yeah.
That's the equivalent of not paying attention to good audio quality if you want to wrap it around, a gold standard brand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Kelli talked about giving listeners an experience and making sure that it's content they need, content that they'll gain something from, and then also thinking about why they would want to come back and listen to more. And just those things, they sound quite simple, but you do need a strategy around all of that just to come up with the right content, putting the right content together, then producing it at the right level, and then marketing it to your audience. And if brands think they can do that for almost no money or do it themselves internally, I personally think in most cases, they're kidding themselves, unless they're very lucky that they have some experienced people inside their business that have some journalistic and audio production background.
40% of Australian adults are listening to podcasts. There's a huge audience there. Recognise that, and understand where your market is, and do it properly. Invest in it.
Well said. I think that's about all we've got time for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. For more about us and how we can help you use audio content to build engagement, go to be.com.au. From all of us at B Media Production, thanks so much for listening.